Dinner seemed to always be the busiest time of day for the two chefs. Then again, this time of day never had a set schedule, as dinner would be served once the SUVs arrived at random hours. Larry and Flora never minded their hours and enjoyed always being on their toes. They especially loved serving, but loved their checks a little more, so they'd never be found complaining nor frowning. Larry was in the middle of chopping a few carrots, and Flora was on break reading a book when the radio on the side of the counter crackled.
Quel est le plat du jour? Daddy's quite famished,
asked a muffled voice excitedly. Flora immediately looked up and answered,
Mr. White, today's dish is steak with baked potatoes and gravy-like stew, sir.
Ah, sounds delectable. And the steak will be made to my liking, yes?
inquired the muffled voice.
Yes, sir. Medium rare.
Flora stared intently at the radio as if it were personally interviewing her.
Fantastic.
The radio crackled once again and was then followed by silence. Suddenly a chime went off in the kitchen. Flora put down her book and hurried to the sink to wash her hands. It seemed that the food had already been prepared, apart from the steak, which Flora was now taking care of while Larry was preparing the dishes. Meanwhile, the beefy men routinely made their way into the entertainment room. Mrs. Marbles just so happened to be in there dusting when she noticed all the men strolling in.
Huh, it's barely 5 in the afternoon,
she said curiously. Boss got hungry, one of the men replied nonchalantly. Mrs. Marbles raised her eyebrows and resumed her dusting. Flora was busy cooking the steak to its desired perfection, while Larry pulled out a large gold platter with a matching lid. Flora promptly placed the meat onto the gold platter and signalled Larry to place the silverware on the side. As Larry did so, Flora immediately made a stern noise in objection.
He uses his own,
she said as she quickly pulled out the knife from the neatly wrapped napkin.
Remember?
Larry nodded quietly and wrapped the napkin neatly once again. After the dish was complete, Flora wiped her hands on her apron and quickly fixed any flyaway hairs that were poking out of her cap. Feeling presentable once again, Flora took a deep breath and began to roll the golden cart and platter out to the dining room. Larry, who followed closely behind, held a crystal glass and a bottle of bourbon in his hands. The dining room was empty, but the two chefs proceeded to set the end of the very large table for one. Mrs. Marbles walked in and smiled at the chefs.
That looks wonderful as usual. I'll go let him know that his dinner has been served.
Mrs. Marbles unlocked the oak door that led to the large stairway and made her way through all the following doors to the master bedroom. Mrs. Marbles approached the master bedroom door and knocked twice, but there was no answer. She furrowed her brows and unlocked the door to make sure she was hearing correctly. The room, however, was empty, and Mrs. Marbles proceeded to check around the whole mansion for her boss. She found herself back in the dining room with the two chefs who were patiently standing by the table.
I'm having a bit of trouble locating Mr. White, but perhaps he's gone somewhere. After all, it's unlike him to notify anyone of his absence, so I bet that's just it. But I do have an idea.
Trailing off, Mrs. Marbles walked to the entertainment room to inquire about the absence. The men in the entertainment room were all minding their own business as usual when Mrs. Marbles walked up to the nearest man on the couch and placed her delicate hand on his beefy shoulder.
Darling,
she whispered as she leaned in,
do you happen to know where your boss went after you all came in?
The man shrugged his shoulders and replied, Not sure, but he was the last to get out. I mean, he seemed bothered, but I don't know, he's been like that a lot lately. Boss seems to get a little more angry every time we do another run. But the thing is, we didn't even finish the last one. We left on his orders because he said he was hungry. Mrs. Marbles thought to herself for a bit, but caught herself staring furrow-browed at the man and quickly readjusted to her sweet smile.
He does have a lot going on, but no need to think about it any further. You know, he's got everything figured out. I was just asking because his food was getting cold.
She chuckled and tapped the man's arm playfully. The man turned back to watch the television screen as if the conversation never happened, and Mrs. Marbles continued to smile until she turned her back to where her concerned expression returned. She pondered to herself for a moment while walking to the dining room when she suddenly stopped in her tracks as she remembered something. The two chefs looked at her with a bit of curiosity, but kept quiet. Mrs. Marbles looked puzzled for a second until her smile returned and an overall state of ease rested upon her aged face.
I think I may know exactly where he's at,
she said aloud with a smile. She hurried to unlock the oak door from the dining room once again, and climbed the stairs until she stopped when she arrived at the top. Just as she suspected, there was a bit of dust on the ground. Of course, no one would be able to notice that dust, unless they were Mrs. Marbles herself, who thoroughly dusts the entire mansion from 9 AM to 12 PM every single day. Cautiously, she bent down to push in the tiny section of trim, and it clicked as usual to reveal a door in the wall. She quickly let herself in and closed the door behind her. The red door ahead glowed in the dim lighting that lined the narrow hallway walls. Mrs. Marbles quietly walked towards the red door and heard footsteps behind it. She paused for a moment, thinking that the footsteps were going towards the door, but they just kept making noise and didn't go anywhere at all. She then placed her hand on the doorknob and slowly turned to crack the door open, just slightly. Mrs. Marbles peeped inside and gasped quietly to herself. Books were scattered across the floor and rolls of paper covered the large oak desk. She opened the door a little wider, and just to the left of the desk was a tall man pacing back and forth. She cleared her throat and the man stopped pacing. He stood in place with his head still faced towards the ground, and Mrs. Marbles let herself in.
"Sir, your food has been served,"
Mrs. Marbles said slowly, while looking around at all the scattered books.
"but I see that your appetite lies elsewhere. Stress is the silent killer, you know."
The man, still staring at the floor, puffed through his nose and turned towards her. As the sun began to set, dark clouds slowly began to form over the estate, and the damp smell of the evening air danced around in the light breeze. Wren the gardener was debating whether to water the grass or not, since it looked like it was about to rain soon. Ultimately, he decided to wait and took a seat underneath the chromatic umbrella. Routinely, Wren had a drink with a cocktail umbrella that matched the giant one above him. After about 20 minutes of watching the weather, Wren noticed tiny ripples in his drink begin to form.
"Huh, looks like the boys are at it again,"
he said to himself while picking up the drink to take another sip. He stared out into the sky while he listened to the sounds of the very distant vehicles approaching. Wren had his eyes fixed on a particularly dark shaded cloud. It was hovering lower than the rest, and had a very tenebrous presence that stood out. He noticed thin bolts of lightning wisp through and illuminate the cloud in a deep plum colour. Wren kept his calmed eyes fixed on the cloud, until he suddenly began to stare at it as if it became threatening.
"Wait a second.
Wren whispered to himself as his brow began to furrow.
The vehicles. They came back around 5 PM. They never left since."
He turned his head, and sure enough, a few white vans burst through the estate gates. The frightened gardener ran as fast as his legs would take him to the already opened garages and slammed his fist on the button that closed them. He looked back for a second on the closing garage doors and ran inside. He first saw the two chefs standing in the dining room, who looked puzzled at how alarmed he was.
"They're coming!"
Wren panted and hurried to the entertainment room where the armed men were located. He nearly tripped into the room when a few of the men quickly stood up on Wren's sudden entrance.
"Intruders! Outside!"
The alarmed gardener was out of breath by now, and he grabbed onto the wall for support as all the men jumped to their feet. Sounds of orders and the cocking of rifles now filled the entertainment room.
"I hear them. Don't let them get past the first floor,"
one of them shouted.
"Where's Boss?"
asked another.
"Never mind where Boss is. Do you think he'll want us standing around like a bunch of idiots while the shit hits the fan?"
replied another across the room. The two chefs in the dining room were now alarmed, but didn't know what to do. Flora looked around at all the men flooding into the dining room and garage area. Two men ran behind the chefs to post up next to the French doors that led to the staircase. Unsettled, Larry slowly set down the crystal glass and bottle of bourbon onto the table. Flora and Larry quickly looked towards the kitchen area.
"You heard that, right?"
asked Flora quietly. Larry nodded his head and turned to the men who were kneeling by the garages and doors to the staircase. The two armed men behind the chefs heard the noise this time and immediately pointed their rifles in its direction. A few moments of silence passed until sounds of muffled voices could be heard beyond the kitchen walls. Flora's eyes widened in fear. She said,
Guys, I think..."
The entire mansion shook as a large breach burst through the kitchen walls, debris and dust filling the air. Larry and Flora ran to the entertainment room for cover while the men unloaded their magazines into the breach. Unfamiliar men emerged from the debris, and gunfire now sprayed from all directions. Within a few long minutes, the intruders lay lifeless on the floor as the smoke and dust settled onto every surface. An eerie silence, apart from the cautious footsteps of the men with rifles still drawn, lingered in the musty air. About 12 of the armed men hastened through the breach to secure the estate's perimeter, while the rest remained idle to keep guard inside. The two chefs and the gardener hesitantly came out of their hiding places to see what had happened in the dining room. There was nothing any of them could have done to prepare for what they were about to see. About 15 bodies were scattered across the floors, and crimson liquid painted the white walls. The men of the mansion stepped over the bodies and occasionally poked them with their rifle nozzles to make sure they weren't alive. Larry and Flora had their eyes fixed on the lifeless body who was drooped over the table where they had neatly arranged a dinner for one. It was silent until the footsteps echoed behind the French doors. A tall man came into view shortly after the dust from the doors slamming open settled. Mrs. Marble stood behind him with her hand over her mouth in shock at the scene. The man was pale-coloured, but his dark green hair stood out bold against his skin. His hair was slicked back with a few hairs dangling over his forehead, which eerily complemented his chiselled face. His black Oxford looked harsh against the pale debris, and as he stepped more into view, the scars all over his face became more defined. He appeared to be wearing dark under-eye makeup, and a paint across his lips that matched the deep colour of the fresh-stained walls. Paint on the man's lips would have appeared to be neat if it weren't for a large scar that trailed from his bottom lip to the bottom of his chin, forever skewing the illusion of perfection. The lining of his top lip had a few scars as well, and his thin nose had another, going halfway across. The most notable scar on the man's face was just above his right eyebrow and curved down to his eyelid. It was shaped in a way that made him appear angry or disturbed. Apart from all the scars, the crimson on his lips was painted in a way that made him look as if he was constantly smiling, despite the top half of his face that looked anything but amused. The man rolled up his sleeves of his dark magenta-coloured dress shirt and clasped his gloved hands together as he stepped over a few bodies. Mrs. Marbles, Wren, the two chefs, and the armed men inside all watched soundlessly. The man looked at the gold platter and frowned at the dead body who was drooping over it. He stepped over and grabbed a fistful of the corpse's hair to lift up its head.
Oh, I'm sorry. Were you going to eat that?
He gestured at the corpse and let out a piercing cackle before promptly tossing the body onto the floor with the rest. The man then pulled a chair out from the table and took a seat. Without looking at his audience, he lifted the lid to the blood-stained platter and closed his eyes as the pungent smell of the medium-rare meat filled his nostrils. He opened his eyes and grabbed the shiny fork from the still neatly wrapped napkin. Then he leaned down and tugged on his right trouser leg to grab his knife from the holster around his ankle. He poked his fork into the steak and began slicing away with his knife.
Annoying,
the man said with his piercing hazel eyes fixed on the steak. He took a bite of one of the cut-up pieces and raised his brows in approval.
Goons, get this all cleaned up,
he said as he waved his fork around at all the dead corpses.
Marbles, you may dismiss yourself for the night. Mes félicitations, chef. It is delectable as always. You two may sit tight for the night as well. Wren, start up the pit, will you? Goons, you know what to do. Looks like we're going to have ourselves quite the barbecue.
Wren nodded in agreement, but took a gulp before replying.
Sir, I've been watching the forecast all day, and I believe it's about to rain.
Ah!
Exclaimed the man at the table.
I am well aware, and I am also very certain that I will not ask you twice.
The man had said every word in an eerily calm voice without looking up.
Of course, sir. I'll get started right away.
Wren regretted speaking up in the first place. He glanced through the breach and saw that the rain had passed when the whole intruder fiasco was occurring. The corpse that the tall man had thrown to the floor happened to be facing in his direction. The man, while chewing on his dinner, winked at the corpse and said, "Thanks for keeping it warm. By the way, what you guys did to my kitchen wasn't very nice. I tried to make my business commendable. I try. Trying simply isn't good enough anymore, and it took you to show me that. Now all that's left to do is just do. Thank you. May you rot in pieces." The man picked up the broken bourbon bottle and rose it in the air before taking a drink. As if on cue, the corpse that was facing the man was now being dragged away to its fiery grave.